Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr.D English, the place where we make English feel less like homework and more like something you can actually use in real life. Today we're talking about one of the strangest, funniest, and most frustrating parts of English, and that is idioms.
Which is a very polite way of saying that native speakers somehow agreed to say completely bizarre things with a straight face, and everybody else just went along with it.
Exactly. And that is what makes idioms so confusing for learners. A lot of the time, the problem is not that your English is weak. The problem is that you can understand every single word in a sentence and still have no idea what the person actually means.
That is such a real problem, because if someone says something like, "Well, that's the elephant in the room," you understand elephant, you understand room, and somehow you are still completely lost.
Right, because idioms are not really about the literal meaning of the words. They are fixed expressions, and the real meaning sits underneath the sentence. So today, we're going through 10 weird English idioms that sound ridiculous if you translate them word for word, but native speakers use them all the time.
And we're going to explain them like normal people, not like a dictionary trying to ruin your afternoon.
That is exactly the goal. So let's start with one of the most famous ones, the elephant in the room.
This one means the big, awkward issue that everybody knows is there, but nobody wants to mention because the second you bring it up, the whole mood changes.
Exactly. Imagine a family dinner where two people had an argument earlier in the day, and everybody is sitting there pretending to enjoy the food while the tension is practically sitting at the table with them. That argument is the elephant in the room.
What I like about this idiom is that the image is actually pretty good, because if there really were an elephant in the room, nobody could honestly ignore it. And yet, that is basically what people do with uncomfortable topics all the time.
Yes, and if someone says, "Let's talk about the elephant in the room," what they mean is, can we stop pretending and deal with the obvious problem already?
Which is usually the right move, although maybe not in the middle of dessert.
Maybe not in the middle of dessert. All right, next one. You can say that again.
This one is funny because, on the surface, it sounds like you are asking the other person to repeat themselves, but that is not what it means at all. It really means, "I completely agree with you."
So if I say, "This has been a ridiculously long week," and you say, "You can say that again," you are not asking me to perform the line twice. You are saying, "Yes, absolutely, that is completely true."
And that is why idioms mess with learners, because the literal meaning sends you in the wrong direction. You think you are following the sentence, and then suddenly the real meaning is somewhere else.
That is such a big part of learning natural English, because at some point you stop asking, "What do these words mean separately?" and you start asking, "What is this person trying to say as a whole?"
And honestly, that shift changes everything, because that is when English starts feeling more alive and less mechanical.
Now let's move to one that is a little more dramatic. Lose your marbles.
This is such a funny expression, because it makes it sound like your mental stability is somehow stored inside a little bag of colorful glass balls.
Which would be very inconvenient, really. But in normal English, if someone says, "I'm losing my marbles," they usually mean they are getting overwhelmed, confused, or frustrated. It can be serious in some contexts, but a lot of the time it is just an exaggerated way of saying, "This situation is driving me crazy."
So if your laptop freezes, your phone dies, your internet disappears, and then your password suddenly stops working for no reason, you might say, "I'm actually losing my marbles today."
Exactly. And nobody hearing that will imagine little marbles rolling across the floor. They will just understand that you are fed up and mentally exhausted.
Although, I do still enjoy the image.
It is a great image. All right, the next one is one a lot of learners hear early. butterflies in my stomach.
This means you feel nervous, especially before something important, like an interview, a first date, an exam, or any moment where your brain suddenly decides to become completely unhelpful.
That is very accurate. And what I like about this idiom is that it actually matches the feeling pretty well. When you are nervous, your stomach can feel weird and fluttery. So even though the phrase sounds poetic, it makes emotional sense.
Yes, this one is weird, but not random weird. It has a kind of emotional logic to it. If someone says, "I had butterflies in my stomach before my driving test," you instantly understand that nervous energy.
And that is a useful thing to notice, because not all idioms are equally strange. Some sound absurd from beginning to end, while others are odd but still vivid.
Which brings us to one of the most relatable idioms in the language. Easier said than done.
This one means exactly what it sounds like, which is honestly refreshing. It means that talking about something is simple, but actually doing it is difficult.
So if someone says, "You should just stop overthinking," you can say, "Well, that's easier said than done." Because yes, the advice is simple, but the reality is a lot messier.
And that is why this idiom gets used so much. It is practical, it is flexible, and it works in everyday life. Learning phrasal verbs is easier said than done. Saving money is easier said than done. Waking up early every single day is easier said than done.
Especially when the person giving the advice is already the kind of person who wakes up at 5 in the morning and drinks lemon water with genuine excitement.
Yes, that advice always sounds very confident coming from those people.
Too confident.
All right, let's keep going with "let the cat out of the bag."
This means to reveal a secret, usually by accident. And I think that "usually by accident" part matters, because the phrase often has that feeling of, "Oops, I was not supposed to say that."
Exactly. So if your friend is planning a surprise birthday party and you casually say, "What time should I come tomorrow for the decorations?" Then, congratulations, you have let the cat out of the bag.
And the great mystery, of course, is why there was ever a cat in a bag to begin with.
That is one of the beautiful things about idioms. At some point, you stop asking why, and you just accept that English has made another strange choice.
That really is the survival strategy. Because if you demand logic from every idiom, English is going to wear you out.
Very true. Now we have hit the sack or hit the hay, both of which mean go to bed.
And both of which sound much more aggressive than they really are.
Yes, they do. If I say I'm going to hit the sack, I do not mean I am angry at my bed. I just mean I am tired and I am going to sleep.
This is one of those idioms that sounds more natural the more you hear it. At first, it feels odd, but after a while, you stop noticing it, especially in movies, TV, and casual conversation.
And that is another thing learners should remember. A phrase can feel weird the first 10 times and perfectly normal the next 50. Familiarity changes everything.
That is a comforting thought, actually, because a lot of English becomes easier not because it gets more logical, but because it gets more familiar.
That is very true. All right, next one. The best thing since sliced bread.
Which is such a dramatic compliment when you really think about it, because sliced bread is apparently one of humanity's greatest milestones.
Apparently so. But if someone says something is the best thing since sliced bread, they mean it is amazing, incredibly useful, or unusually impressive.
So if your friend gets noise-canceling headphones for the first time and suddenly starts acting like their whole life has changed, they might say, "These are the best thing since sliced bread."
Exactly. And even if the phrase sounds a little old-fashioned, People still use it, often with a bit of humor. It is one of those expressions that survives because it is memorable.
And honestly, that is true of a lot of idioms. They are weird, but they stick in your head, and maybe that is part of why they survive.
That is a really good point. Next one, the bee's knees.
I love this one because it sounds like somebody just looked at a bee and decided that one random body part represented excellence.
That does seem to be the process, yes. But this idiom means something is excellent, stylish, or really impressive. If someone says, "That cafe is the bee's knees," they mean they think it is fantastic.
I would say this one feels playful and maybe a little old school, but native speakers still understand it. And sometimes people use it specifically because it sounds fun.
Yes, and that matters too. Not every idiom is super common in everyday speech, but many are still culturally alive. Even if you do not use them often yourself, it helps a lot to recognize them when someone else does.
Because comprehension comes first. And that is something learners sometimes forget. You do not need to use every expression immediately. Sometimes the win is simply hearing it and not panicking.
That is such a good way to put it. All right, our last one is, "It takes two to tango."
This means that when something happens between two people, especially conflict or drama, both people probably played a part in it.
Exactly. So if two coworkers are always arguing and one says, "It's all his fault," someone else might say, "Well, it takes two to tango," meaning this probably is not a one-person situation.
And I like this idiom because it is actually quite elegant. It says something serious in a way that feels memorable. And the image makes sense because a tango is a dance done by two people.
Right, and that brings us to the bigger lesson here. Because these idioms are not just random decorations. They are part of how real English works. Native speakers use them naturally in conversation, media, storytelling, jokes, and everyday reactions, which means learners really do need to get comfortable with them.
And I think the important thing is not to approach idioms like a giant list you have to memorize all at once, because that usually just makes people tired. It is much better to notice them in context, understand the real meaning, and connect them to situations you can imagine.
Yes, because once you connect an idiom to a real situation, it stops being an abstract phrase and starts becoming something usable. "Butterflies in my stomach" sticks better when you remember how you felt before a test. "Let the cat out of the bag" sticks better when you think about a ruined surprise. "Easier said than done" sticks better when you remember advice that sounded simple but was actually annoying to follow.
And that is also why direct translation so often fails. If you only try to convert the words one by one into your own language, you miss the real function of the phrase.
Exactly, because idioms are really about meaning in context, not just vocabulary. That is why learners sometimes get frustrated and think, "Why do I still feel confused if I know so many words?" Well, this is one reason. Natural English is full of these little hidden meanings.
So maybe the goal is not to make every idiom logical, because that is probably impossible. Maybe the goal is just to get used to the fact that English, like every language, has its own weird habits.
Yes, and once you stop expecting perfect logic, idioms become a lot less annoying and a lot more interesting.
That is a very healthy attitude for English in general, honestly.
It really is. So if you want to practice after this episode, pick 3 idioms from today and write one real sentence for each of them. Make the sentences personal if you can, because the more real they feel to you, the easier they are to remember.
For example, you could write, "I had butterflies in my stomach before my presentation." Or, "Talking to my boss about the problem was easier said than done." Or, "At dinner, Everybody ignored the elephant in the room.
Exactly. And if you can do that, you are already moving beyond memorization and into actual use, which is where real progress starts happening.
All right, that is it for today. We hope this made idioms feel a little less mysterious and a little more manageable.
And if one of these expressions still sounds completely ridiculous to you, that is honestly fair. English has earned that reaction.
Very much so.
Thanks for listening to Mr. D English, and we'll see you next time.